March 15, 2015. Cedar Falls, Iowa. On a cold spring morning in Cedar Falls, Iowa, Sarah Mitchell stood in her childhood home's dusty attic, sorting through decades of forgotten memories. The 32-year-old marketing executive had returned to her family residence to help her elderly mother prepare for a move to assisted living. Among the cardboard boxes filled with Christmas decorations and old textbooks, Sarah discovered something that would change everything she thought she knew about her elementary school years. Tucked inside a shoebox labeled Sarah's School Things, 1990, she found a bright yellow disposable camera, the kind that was popular before digital photography revolutionized how people captured memories. The Kodak FunSaver camera still had film inside, never developed after all these years. Sarah remembered receiving it as a gift for her 10th birthday and bringing it to school to document her 4th grade class at Riverside Elementary School. 25 years later, driven by curiosity and nostalgia, Sarah decided to have the film processed at the only remaining photo lab in town. The elderly technician warned her that films stored for so long might not produce viable images, but Sarah was determined to see if any memories had survived the passage of time. 3 days later, she returned to collect the developed photographs. Most of the images were exactly what she expected: blurry shots of her classmates during recess, a group photo in front of the school's main entrance, and candid moments from what appeared to be a classroom party. The colors had faded, and some photos showed signs of age-related deterioration, but the memories came flooding back as she examined each picture. However, it was the 7th photograph in the stack that made Sarah's blood run cold. The image showed her 4th grade classroom during what appeared to be a regular school day. Her teacher, Mrs. Elizabeth Parker, stood near the blackboard, and several students sat at their desks. But in the background, partially obscured by a classroom door that had been left ajar, stood a man who didn't belong there. The figure was middle-aged, wearing a dark jacket, and appeared to be watching the children intently. Sarah studied the photograph under better lighting and realized this wasn't a teacher, janitor, or any school staff member she remembered. The man's presence in the classroom seemed deliberate, yet somehow secretive, as if he was trying to remain unnoticed while observing the students. Sarah's initial confusion quickly transformed into unease as more details became apparent. The man's positioning suggested he had been there for some time, comfortable enough to stand in the doorway without anyone questioning his presence. Even more disturbing was the realization that none of the children in the photograph, including herself, appeared to notice or react to his presence, suggesting this might have been a regular occurrence. The photograph was dated on the back, April 12, 1990. Sarah tried to recall that specific day, but like most childhood memories, the details were hazy. She remembered Mrs. Parker as a kind teacher who made learning enjoyable, and Riverside Elementary as a safe, nurturing environment where parents trusted their children would be protected and cared for. Determined to understand what she had discovered, Sarah began examining the other photographs more carefully. In 2 additional images, she could make out what appeared to be the same figure, though partially obscured or at the edge of the frame. The man seemed to have access to different areas of the school, appearing in what looked like a hallway shot, and again near what she recognized as the school's library entrance. The implications of these discoveries sent chills down Sarah's spine. Who was this man, and why did he have such unrestricted access to elementary school children in 1990? Why couldn't she remember seeing him during her time at Riverside Elementary? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why did it appear that his presence was so normalized that no one seemed to question it? Sarah spent the rest of that evening researching online, trying to find information about Riverside Elementary School's staff from 1990. She located the school's old yearbooks and staff directories, but found no record of any male employee or volunteer who matched the appearance of the man in her photographs. The mystery deepened as she realized that this individual seemed to operate within the school environment without any official documentation of his role or purpose. As the night wore on, Sarah made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately expose a decades-old conspiracy of silence. She would reach out to her former classmates and try to piece together what had really happened during their 4th grade year at Riverside Elementary School. What she would discover would shock not only her former classmates, but an entire community that had unknowingly harbored a dangerous secret for 25 years. The disposable camera that had captured innocent childhood moments had also inadvertently documented something far more sinister, something that would challenge everything Sarah believed about the safety and security of her elementary school experience. As she prepared to contact her old friends, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to uncover a truth that someone had worked very hard to keep buried. March 18, 2015. Digital investigation begins. 3 days after discovering the disturbing photographs, Sarah Mitchell began her search for answers by reaching out to former classmates through social media platforms. Her first contact was Michael Thompson, who now worked as an accountant in Des Moines and had maintained connections with several other former students from Riverside Elementary School. Michael's initial response was enthusiastic, expressing excitement about reconnecting after so many years. However, when Sarah shared the mysterious photographs and asked about the unidentified man, Michael's tone shifted noticeably. He admitted to having vague recollections of an adult male who wasn't a regular teacher but seemed to be around the school frequently during their 4th grade year. According to Michael's fragmented memories, this individual occasionally appeared in classrooms during lessons, sometimes carrying what appeared to be educational materials or small gifts for students. Michael recalled feeling confused about the man's role, but assumed he was some kind of special volunteer or educational consultant that the administration had approved. Sarah's next contact was Jessica Davis, now a nurse practitioner living in Cedar Rapids. Jessica's response proved even more intriguing and troubling. She distinctly remembered the man from the photographs and revealed that he had approached her personally on multiple occasions, engaging in conversations about her interests and family life. Jessica described feeling uncomfortable during these interactions, though she couldn't articulate why at the time. The man had asked detailed questions about her home life, her parents' work schedules, and her after-school activities. He had also given her small gifts, including candy and stickers, which she had initially appreciated but later felt were somehow inappropriate. More disturbing was Jessica's recollection that this individual seemed to have detailed knowledge about various students in their class. He knew their names, their academic performance, and personal information that wouldn't normally be available to casual visitors or volunteers. This suggested a level of access and integration into the school community that went far beyond what would be typical for an unauthorized presence. Sarah then reached out to Christopher Anderson, who had become a high school teacher in a neighboring district. Christopher's memories were particularly unsettling because he recalled being specifically selected for individual attention by the mysterious man. According to Christopher, this person had arranged private conversations with certain students, often during lunch periods or recess time when supervision was less structured. Christopher remembered being told that these conversations were part of a special program designed to help students with their academic or social development. The man had presented himself as someone qualified to provide guidance and support, though Christopher couldn't recall any formal introduction or explanation of his credentials. What made Christopher's account even more concerning was his description of the selection process. The man seemed to focus on specific students, particularly those who appeared shy, withdrawn, or who might benefit from additional adult attention. This pattern suggested a deliberate targeting strategy rather than random interactions with children. Amanda Roberts, now working as a social worker in Minneapolis, provided perhaps the most detailed and disturbing recollections. She remembered the man with crystal clarity and revealed that he had established ongoing relationships with several students that extended beyond casual school interactions. Amanda recalled that this individual had positioned himself as a mentor figure, offering academic help and emotional support to students who might be struggling with various challenges. He had created an impression of being specially qualified to work with children, and had gained the trust of both students and school staff through his apparent knowledge and professional demeanor. Most troubling was Amanda's memory of being invited to participate in what the man described as educational activities that would take place outside of regular classroom time. These sessions were presented as beneficial opportunities for academic enrichment and personal development, though Amanda couldn't recall any specific details about what these activities involved. The pattern emerging from these conversations was deeply concerning. The mysterious man had operated within Riverside Elementary School with apparent authority and access, developing relationships with students that went far beyond what would be appropriate for any legitimate educational volunteer or consultant. Sarah's investigation took a more serious turn when she decided to contact Mrs. Elizabeth Parker, their former fourth-grade teacher. Now in her 70s and long retired, Mrs. Parker initially seemed pleased to hear from a former student. However, when Sarah mentioned the photographs and asked about the unidentified man, Mrs. Parker's demeanor changed dramatically. The former teacher became evasive and defensive, claiming that her memory of events from 25 years ago was too unclear to provide reliable information. She insisted that all adults who had access to students during her tenure were properly authorized and supervised by the school administration. However, Mrs. Parker's obvious discomfort and reluctance to discuss the topic convinced Sarah that the teacher knew more than she was willing to admit. The conversation ended abruptly when Mrs. Parker claimed she had other commitments and couldn't continue the discussion. This reaction from their former teacher was particularly troubling because it suggested that the mysterious man's presence hadn't been as innocent or authorized as he had made it appear. If Mrs. Parker had nothing to hide, she would presumably be willing to help clarify the situation and provide information about legitimate educational programs that might explain the man's presence. As Sarah compiled the information from her former classmates, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The unidentified man had operated with remarkable freedom within their elementary school, developing relationships with students that crossed normal boundaries and engaging in behaviors that, in retrospect, seemed calculated and potentially predatory. The fact that multiple students had similar memories of inappropriate attention, gift-giving, and private conversations suggested that this wasn't a case of mistaken identity or innocent misunderstanding. Instead, it appeared that their elementary school had been infiltrated by someone who had managed to gain access to children while avoiding proper oversight or accountability. Most chilling was the realization that this situation had apparently continued for an extended period without detection or intervention by school administrators, teachers, or parents. The man's ability to operate so freely suggested either remarkable deception on his part or a failure of protective systems that should have been in place to safeguard students. As Sarah prepared to take her investigation to the next level, she couldn't escape the growing certainty that she had stumbled upon evidence of something far more serious than a simple case of unauthorized school access. The photographs that had seemed like innocent childhood memories were beginning to reveal a much darker truth about her elementary school experience. March 25, 2015, Cedar Falls. Police Department. Sarah Mitchell's investigation took a dramatic turn when she decided to expand her search beyond her immediate classmates. Through school alumni networks and social media groups, she managed to contact students from other grades who had attended Riverside Elementary during the same period. What she discovered would transform her personal quest for answers into a criminal investigation. Anthony Williams, who had been in third grade during the 1989-1990 school year, provided the breakthrough Sarah had been seeking. Unlike the fragmented memories of her fourth-grade classmates, Anthony remembered the mysterious man with startling clarity. More importantly, he recalled the man's name, Daniel Foster. According to Anthony's recollections, Foster had presented himself as an educational consultant, specializing in child development and learning disabilities. He claimed to work with multiple schools throughout the district, evaluating students who might benefit from additional academic support or intervention programs. This explanation had satisfied both teachers and administrators, providing Foster with legitimate-seeming credentials that allowed him unrestricted access to students. Anthony's memories revealed that Foster had operated with sophisticated planning and manipulation. He had established relationships with key school personnel by demonstrating apparent expertise in educational psychology and child behavior. Foster regularly attended faculty meetings and participated in discussions about student progress, creating an impression of professional competence and authority. More disturbing was Anthony's recollection of Foster's selection criteria for students requiring his specialized attention. Foster seemed to target children from single-parent households, those whose parents worked multiple jobs, or students who appeared to lack strong support systems at home. This systematic approach suggested that Foster was deliberately identifying vulnerable children who were less likely to report inappropriate behavior or whose reports might be dismissed or overlooked. Sarah's investigation expanded when she contacted Patricia Lee, a former fifth-grade student who had vivid and troubling memories of Foster's behavior. Patricia revealed that Foster had established a pattern of removing selected students from regular classroom activities for what he termed individual assessment sessions. These sessions took place in unused classrooms or administrative offices, away from the supervision of regular teaching staff. Patricia's account included details about Foster's methodology that were deeply concerning. He would begin each interaction by asking personal questions about home life, family relationships, and any problems the student might be experiencing. Foster positioned himself as a trusted adult who understood children's needs better than their parents or teachers, gradually building emotional dependence and isolation. The manipulation extended to Foster's use of rewards and special privileges to reinforce his relationship with targeted students. He provided candy, small toys, and other gifts while emphasizing that these were special secrets between him and the child. Foster also arranged for certain students to assist with classroom tasks or administrative duties, creating opportunities for unsupervised interaction during school hours. Benjamin Garcia, another former student Sarah contacted, provided perhaps the most detailed account of Foster's methods. Benjamin recalled that Foster had established what he called a mentorship program for students who showed academic potential but faced challenges at home. This program involved after-school sessions and weekend activities that were presented as educational opportunities. Benjamin's memories included disturbing details about the psychological manipulation Foster employed to maintain control over his relationships with students. Foster would alternate between excessive praise and subtle criticism, creating emotional instability that made children more dependent on his approval and guidance. He also used information gathered during private conversations to demonstrate his special understanding of each child's needs and circumstances. The pattern of behavior described by multiple former students painted a picture of sophisticated predatory conduct that had continued for an extended period without detection. Foster's ability to manipulate both children and adults demonstrated a level of planning and psychological sophistication that made his actions particularly dangerous and effective. Sarah's investigation reached a critical turning point when she decided to present her findings to law enforcement. On March 25, 2015, she walked into the Cedar Falls Police Department, carrying the original photographs and detailed notes from her conversations with former classmates. Detective Kevin Martinez, who specialized in crimes against children, reviewed Sarah's evidence with growing concern. The systematic nature of Foster's behavior, combined with his apparent access to vulnerable children over an extended period, represented exactly the type of predatory pattern that law enforcement had been trained to recognize and investigate. Detective Martinez immediately recognized that the situation Sarah described required urgent attention, even though the events had occurred 25 years earlier. The sophisticated manipulation tactics and institutional access that Foster had achieved suggested a level of criminal sophistication that often indicated multiple victims and ongoing criminal behavior. The detective's initial research into Daniel Foster's background revealed information that confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Foster had indeed worked as an educational consultant during the late 1980s and early 1990s, moving between different school districts throughout Iowa and neighboring states. His credentials, while appearing legitimate at the time, had never been properly verified by the institutions that employed his services. More alarmingly, Detective Martinez discovered that Foster had continued his pattern of behavior well beyond his time at Riverside Elementary School. Records indicated that he had been arrested in 2010 in Minnesota on charges related to child exploitation and abuse. The investigation that led to his arrest had uncovered evidence of systematic predatory behavior spanning multiple decades and involving numerous victims. The detective's research revealed that Foster had died in prison in 2013 while serving his sentence, but not before investigators had identified a network of criminal activity that extended across multiple states. Foster's death had effectively ended the criminal prosecution, but it had also left many questions unanswered about the full extent of his activities and the number of victims he had harmed. Detective Martinez explained to Sarah that Foster's criminal pattern typically involved establishing himself within educational institutions, gaining the trust of administrators and teachers, and then systematically identifying and exploiting vulnerable children. His use of legitimate-seeming credentials and professional demeanor had allowed him to operate undetected for years in multiple locations. The revelation that Foster had been a known criminal who had continued his predatory behavior for decades after leaving Riverside Elementary School transformed Sarah's investigation from a quest for personal answers into evidence of institutional failure and criminal negligence. The fact that Foster had been allowed to operate with such freedom at their elementary school suggested serious problems with background checking procedures and oversight mechanisms. As Detective Martinez began the process of opening a formal investigation into Foster's activities at Riverside Elementary School, Sarah realized that her discovery of the old photographs had implications far beyond her own childhood memories. The evidence she had uncovered might provide closure for other victims and could potentially expose systematic failures that had allowed a dangerous predator to harm children for decades. The investigation was about to reveal that Foster's activities at Riverside Elementary had been even more extensive and damaging than anyone had initially suspected, and that the institutional response to his presence had involved decisions that would shock the entire Cedar Falls community. April 8, 2015, Cedar Falls District Attorney's Office. The investigation into Daniel Foster's activities at Riverside Elementary School took a shocking turn when Detective Kevin Martinez, working alongside Detective Nicole Johnson from the Crimes Against Children Unit, uncovered evidence that the school administration had been aware of Foster's inappropriate behavior, but had failed to take proper action to protect students. The breakthrough came when investigators obtained access to archived school district records that had been stored in a warehouse facility outside Cedar Falls. Among thousands of administrative documents from the 1990s, they discovered a series of internal memoranda that revealed a disturbing pattern of institutional negligence and deliberate cover-up. The first critical document was a complaint filed by Janet Morrison, a substitute teacher who had worked at Riverside Elementary during the spring of 1990. Morrison had submitted a detailed report to the school administration expressing concerns about Foster's unsupervised access to students and his inappropriate questioning of children about their personal lives. Morrison's report, dated April 18, 1990, described observing Foster engaging in behavior that violated standard protocols for interactions between adults and students. She had witnessed him photographing students without parental consent, removing children from supervised activities for private conversations, and maintaining physical contact that seemed unnecessary and inappropriate. The substitute teacher's report also revealed that she had attempted to discuss her concerns with regular classroom teachers, including Elizabeth Parker, but had been told that Foster was a respected educational consultant whose methods were approved by the administration. Morrison's attempts to escalate her concerns had been met with resistance and suggestions that she was overreacting to normal educational practices. What made Morrison's report particularly damning was her detailed documentation of specific incidents and her professional assessment that Foster's behavior represented a serious risk to student safety. As a certified educator with experience in multiple school systems, Morrison had recognized warning signs that should have triggered immediate investigation and intervention. The investigation revealed that Morrison's report had been received by Principal William Chen and Academic Coordinator Michelle Rodriguez, both of whom had chosen to dismiss her concerns without conducting any meaningful investigation. Internal communications showed that Chen and Rodriguez had characterized Morrison's complaints as the result of misunderstanding Foster's specialized educational methods. More disturbing was the discovery that Morrison's concerns had not been the only warning signs that school administrators had received about Foster's behavior. Parents had submitted at least 3 formal complaints between 1989 and 1990, expressing unease about Foster's interactions with their children and requesting information about his credentials and role within the school system. The parent complaints, filed by families whose children had been targeted by Foster for his special attention programs, revealed a pattern of concerning behavior that should have triggered immediate protective measures. Parents reported that their children had come home with gifts from Foster, had described uncomfortable conversations about family life, and had exhibited behavioral changes after participating in his programs. One particularly detailed complaint came from the parents of Timothy Walsh, a fourth grader who had been selected for Foster's mentorship program. Timothy's parents had become concerned when their son began exhibiting anxiety about school attendance and had started having nightmares about adult authority figures. When they questioned Timothy about his experiences with Foster, the child had become withdrawn and refused to discuss the interactions. The Walsh family's complaint had requested a meeting with school administrators to discuss their concerns about Foster's access to their son and to obtain information about the educational qualifications that authorized his work with students. However, archived correspondence showed that Principal Chen had responded by minimizing their concerns and assuring them that Foster was a qualified professional whose methods were endorsed by educational experts. Detective Johnson's investigation revealed that the school administration's response to these complaints had been to transfer Foster to another elementary school within the district rather than conducting a proper investigation or reporting the concerns to appropriate authorities. This decision effectively allowed Foster to continue his predatory behavior with a new group of potential victims while avoiding any accountability for his actions at Riverside Elementary. The transfer had been arranged through informal administrative channels, with no documentation of the reasons for Foster's departure or any warning provided to his new workplace about the concerns that had been raised. This pattern of quiet transfer rather than proper investigation represented a deliberate decision to prioritize institutional reputation over student safety. Further investigation uncovered evidence that Principal Chen and Coordinator Rodriguez had been aware that their handling of the Foster situation violated district policies regarding the investigation of complaints against educational personnel. District guidelines clearly required that any allegations of inappropriate behavior towards students be formally investigated and reported to both district supervisors and appropriate law enforcement agencies. The administrative documents revealed that Chen and Rodriguez had deliberately avoided following these procedures because they feared that a formal investigation would damage the school's reputation and potentially result in legal liability for the district. Internal communications showed that they had discussed the potential negative publicity that could result from acknowledging that an unauthorized individual had gained access to students. Detective Martinez's investigation also uncovered evidence that the school administration had attempted to discredit the credibility of those who had raised concerns about Foster's behavior. Janet Morrison, the substitute teacher who had filed the initial complaint, had been told that her services would no longer be needed by the district. Parents who had expressed concerns had been labeled as overly protective or difficult to work with. This pattern of retaliation against those who attempted to protect children represented a systematic effort to silence potential witnesses and prevent further complaints about Foster's activities. The administration's response had effectively created an environment where concerned adults were discouraged from reporting suspicious behavior or advocating for student safety. The investigation revealed that Foster's removal from Riverside Elementary had not been the end of his criminal activity within the Cedar Falls School District. Records showed that he had continued working with students at Jefferson Elementary School for an additional 2 years before finally being quietly asked to discontinue his services following additional complaints from parents and teachers. During his time at Jefferson Elementary, Foster had refined his manipulation techniques and had become even more systematic in his targeting of vulnerable students. His ability to operate across multiple schools within the same district demonstrated the effectiveness of the administration's decision to transfer rather than investigate, as it had allowed him to continue harming children while avoiding accountability. The evidence uncovered by the investigation painted a picture of institutional failure that extended far beyond simple negligence or oversight. The documented decisions by Chen and Rodriguez to suppress complaints, transfer rather than investigate, and retaliate against those who raised concerns represented a deliberate conspiracy to prioritize institutional interests over the safety and welfare of the children they were entrusted to protect. As Detective Johnson prepared to present the findings to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges against the former administrators, the investigation had revealed that Foster's predatory behavior had been enabled by a network of institutional silence that had allowed him to harm an estimated 12 children over a 3-year period within the Cedar Falls school system. The discovery of this conspiracy of silence would soon lead to criminal charges that would shock the Cedar Falls community and force a reckoning with the systematic failures that had protected a predator while abandoning the children who depended on adults to keep them safe. June 12, 2015, Iowa State Courthouse, Cedar Falls. The criminal charges filed against former Riverside Elementary School administrators William Chen and Michelle Rodriguez sent shockwaves through the Cedar Falls community. District Attorney Robert Davidson announced that both former officials would face multiple felony counts, including criminal negligence, child endangerment, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and violation of mandatory reporting laws. The indictments represented the culmination of a 3-month investigation that had uncovered not only the institutional cover-up of Daniel Foster's predatory behavior, but also evidence of a broader pattern of administrative misconduct that had endangered children. Throughout the Cedar Falls school system during the early 1990s, William Chen, now 67 years old and long retired from education, was arrested at his home in a quiet suburban neighborhood where he had lived peacefully for decades. The former principal's arrest marked a dramatic fall from grace for someone who had once been considered a pillar of the educational community and had received numerous awards for his contributions to public education. Michelle Rodriguez, 59, who had continued working in educational administration until her retirement in 2012, was taken into custody at the consulting firm where she worked part-time. Her arrest was particularly shocking to colleagues who knew her as an advocate for student welfare and educational reform, unaware of her role in the Foster cover-up 2 decades earlier. The charges against both administrators were based on evidence that they had knowingly violated Iowa state laws requiring educational personnel to report suspected child abuse or neglect to appropriate authorities. The investigation had revealed that Chen and Rodriguez had not only failed to report concerns about Foster's behavior, but had actively worked to suppress information that could have led to his prosecution. More damaging was evidence that the administrators had deliberately destroyed or hidden documents related to complaints about Foster's activities. Forensic analysis of archived computer systems had recovered deleted files showing that Rodriguez had attempted to eliminate electronic records of parent complaints and internal communications about Foster's behavior. The prosecution's case was strengthened by the decision of several former students to come forward publicly with their accounts of Foster's abuse. Matthew Brown, now a successful attorney in Chicago, broke his decades-long silence about his experiences as one of Foster's victims at Riverside Elementary School. Matthew's testimony revealed the long-term psychological impact of the abuse he had suffered and the additional trauma caused by the institutional betrayal of adults who should have protected him. His account detailed how Foster's systematic grooming and manipulation had affected his ability to trust authority figures and had required years of therapy to overcome. Lauren Wilson, now a mother of 3 and living in California, also chose to testify about her experiences with Foster. Her testimony was particularly powerful because she had been one of the students whose parents had filed complaints about Foster's behavior, complaints that Chen and Rodriguez had dismissed and buried. Lauren's account revealed how the administrator's failure to act had not only allowed Foster to continue abusing her, but had also sent a message to other potential victims that their concerns would not be taken seriously. The institutional betrayal had compounded the trauma of the abuse itself, creating wounds that had taken decades to heal. The prosecution presented evidence that at least 12 children had been victimized by Foster during his time at Riverside Elementary and Jefferson Elementary schools. The systematic nature of Foster's abuse, combined with the administrator's deliberate cover-up, had created an environment where predatory behavior could flourish unchecked. Expert testimony from child psychologists and educational policy specialists painted a damning picture of the administrator's decisions. Dr. Rachel Green, a nationally recognized authority on institutional child abuse, testified that Chen and Rodriguez's actions represented a textbook example of how institutional priorities could override child protection responsibilities. The defense attorneys for both administrators attempted to argue that their clients had acted according to the standards and practices common in educational administration during the 1990s. They claimed that procedures for handling allegations of inappropriate behavior had been less developed at that time, and that their clients had believed they were acting in the best interests of all involved. However, the prosecution successfully demonstrated that even by 1990 standards, Chen and Rodriguez had violated clearly established legal and ethical obligations. Iowa state law had required mandatory reporting of suspected child abuse since 1975, and school district policies had explicitly outlined procedures for investigating and reporting concerns about adult interactions with students. The trial revealed additional evidence of the administrator's misconduct, including attempts to intimidate parents who had raised concerns about foster and efforts to prevent substitute teacher Janet Morrison from working in other schools within the district. These actions demonstrated that Chen and Rodriguez had not simply made poor judgment calls, but had engaged in deliberate obstruction of justice. The case attracted national attention from advocacy groups focused on institutional child abuse and educational reform. The foster case became a symbol of how institutional interests could override child protection, even when clear warning signs were present and legal obligations were well established. Media coverage of the trial brought additional victims forward, including former students from other schools where Foster had worked during his decades-long criminal career. The testimony of these additional victims demonstrated that Foster's pattern of behavior had continued long after leaving Cedar Falls, suggesting that earlier intervention could have prevented numerous additional crimes. The emotional impact of the trial extended beyond the courtroom to the broader Cedar Falls community, which struggled to reconcile its image as a safe, family-friendly city with the reality that its educational institutions had harbored and protected a dangerous predator. Many community members expressed shock and anger at the revelation that trusted authority figures had prioritized institutional reputation over child safety. The trial also prompted a comprehensive review of current child protection policies within the Cedar Falls school system and throughout Iowa. Educational officials announced new mandatory training programs for administrators and teachers, enhanced background checking procedures, and strengthened reporting requirements designed to prevent similar failures in the future. Sarah Mitchell, whose discovery of the old photographs had triggered the entire investigation, testified about the impact of learning that her childhood school experience had been tainted by institutional betrayal. Her testimony emphasized how the administrator's failure to protect students had caused lasting harm that extended far beyond Foster's direct victims. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the prosecution presented closing arguments that emphasized the gravity of the administrator's betrayal of their fundamental responsibility to protect the children in their care. The evidence had shown that Chen and Rodriguez had not only failed to prevent Foster's crimes, but had actively enabled them through their deliberate cover-up. The jury's deliberation would determine whether the former administrators would be held accountable for their role in one of the most serious institutional child abuse cases in Iowa history. A case that had demonstrated how the failure of adults in positions of trust could have devastating consequences that lasted for decades. September 14, 2015, Final Resolution and Reform. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict in the case against former Riverside Elementary School administrators William Chen and Michelle Rodriguez. The courtroom was packed with victims, their families, community members, and media representatives as Judge Patricia Morrison prepared to read the jury's decision. William Chen was found guilty on all counts, including criminal negligence, child endangerment, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and violation of mandatory reporting laws. The jury had determined that his deliberate cover-up of Daniel Foster's predatory behavior had directly contributed to the harm suffered by multiple victims over an extended period. Michelle Rodriguez was convicted on the majority of charges, though the jury found her less culpable than Chen due to her subordinate position within the administrative hierarchy. However, Her active participation in destroying evidence and suppressing complaints had made her a willing accomplice in the institutional conspiracy that had protected Foster. Judge Morrison sentenced Chen to 5 years in state prison, emphasizing that his position of trust and authority made his betrayal of child safety responsibilities particularly egregious. The judge noted that Chen's decisions had not only failed to protect the children under his care, but had actively enabled a predator to continue harming vulnerable students. Rodriguez received a sentence of 3 years, with 2 years suspended and 1 year to be served under house arrest, followed by 5 years of probation. Her sentence reflected both her complicity in the cover-up and the court's recognition that she had been operating under Chen's direction as the senior administrator. The sentencing hearing included powerful victim impact statements that revealed the long-term consequences of both Foster's abuse and the institutional betrayal that had enabled it. Former students described decades of psychological trauma, difficulty trusting authority figures, and the additional pain of learning that adults who should have protected them had instead chosen to protect their institution's reputation. Matthew Brown's statement to the court was particularly moving as he described how the knowledge that his abuse could have been prevented had compounded his trauma and delayed his healing process. He emphasized that the administrator's actions had sent a message to victims that their safety was less important than avoiding negative publicity for the school. Lauren Wilson addressed the court about the impact of institutional betrayal on her family relationships and her ability to trust educational institutions with her own children's safety. Her statement highlighted how the administrator's failure had created ripple effects that continued to influence victims' lives decades after the original crimes. The Cedar Falls School District announced a comprehensive settlement agreement with Foster's victims that included financial compensation and funding for ongoing psychological counseling services. The district also committed to implementing extensive reforms designed to prevent similar institutional failures in the future. The settlement included provisions for an independent oversight committee to monitor the district's child protection policies and procedures. This committee, composed of child welfare experts, law enforcement representatives, and community members, would have authority to investigate concerns and recommend policy changes. The case prompted legislation at the state level that strengthened mandatory reporting requirements for educational personnel and increased penalties for administrators who failed to properly investigate or report concerns about child safety. The Foster Prevention Act, as it became known, also required enhanced background checking procedures and regular training updates for all school employees. Sarah Mitchell's role in exposing the decades-old conspiracy transformed her from a marketing executive seeking nostalgic memories into a prominent advocate for institutional transparency and child protection reform. She established the Foster Awareness Foundation, dedicated to educating communities about the warning signs of institutional child abuse and the importance of speaking up when concerns arise. The Foundation's work included developing educational materials for parents, teachers, and administrators about recognizing and responding to potential predatory behavior in educational settings. Sarah's advocacy emphasized that preventing institutional child abuse required vigilance from entire communities, not just formal authorities. The case also led to reforms in how law enforcement agencies handle historical child abuse cases and investigations involving institutional cover-ups. The success of the Foster investigation demonstrated that even decades-old crimes could be prosecuted effectively when sufficient evidence was available and victims were willing to come forward. Detective Kevin Martinez and Detective Nicole Johnson received recognition for their thorough investigation and their sensitive handling of victims who had carried traumatic secrets for decades. Their work became a model for other law enforcement agencies dealing with similar cases of historical institutional abuse. The broader impact of the case extended beyond Cedar Falls to school districts throughout Iowa and neighboring states. Educational administrators across the region reviewed their own policies and procedures, seeking to identify and address potential vulnerabilities that could allow predatory behavior to go undetected or unreported. The Foster case became a case study in criminal justice and educational administration programs, illustrating how institutional interests could override child protection responsibilities and how the failure to act on warning signs could enable systematic abuse over extended periods. For the victims who had finally received justice and acknowledgement of their suffering, the conclusion of the case marked both an ending and a beginning. While the legal proceedings had brought accountability for those who had failed to protect them, the healing process would continue for years to come. The disposable camera that Sarah Mitchell had found in her childhood home's attic had accomplished something remarkable. A simple yellow plastic device that had captured innocent fourth-grade memories had ultimately exposed a decades-old conspiracy, brought justice to victims who had been silenced and ignored, and prompted reforms that would protect future generations of children. The photographs that had revealed Daniel Foster's presence in their elementary school had become more than just evidence of past crimes. They had become symbols of the importance of paying attention to details that others might overlook, of speaking up when something doesn't seem right, and of the power that ordinary citizens possess to expose wrongdoing and demand accountability. As Sarah reflected on the journey that had begun with childhood nostalgia and had led to criminal convictions and systematic reform, she understood that the most important legacy of her discovery was not the punishment of those who had failed in their duties, but the message it sent to future generations about the importance of protecting children and the responsibility that all adults share in creating safe environments for learning and growth. The case had proven that no matter how much time had passed, no matter how well secrets had been buried, and no matter how powerful the institutions involved, the truth could still emerge when ordinary people had the courage to ask difficult questions and demand honest answers. In the end, a 25-year-old photograph had accomplished what institutional oversight, administrative procedures, and professional responsibilities had failed to achieve: the protection of children and the pursuit of justice for those who had been failed by the very people entrusted with their care.